Tonight, I would like to introduce my friend, Kristine Anderson. She has her PhD in communicative arts from Georgia State University. She has taught high school. She's taught at Shorter. She's taught at Southern Polytechnic, which is now part of Kennesaw. And she has been a journalist and has written numerous freelance articles. And the interesting thing, and we'll discuss this some later tonight, she has gone from nonfiction into fiction. This is her debut novel, but it has been very successful. She has won the Farrell Sams Award, and that's an award that's given each year for a novel that speaks to the human condition in a Southern context. And we will talk about that a little later. But tonight, welcome, Kristine. And why don't you just tell us a little bit about your family?
Thank you, Carolyn, and thanks to all of you who are with us tonight. That's the big plus about a Zoom. People can come from all over, all different parts of the country, all different time zones. So thank you all for being here. I've been in Atlanta for 40 plus years. I am married to a man who has long Southern roots. His family on both sides has probably been here for at least 4 generations. And he's a retired teacher. He taught high school math for close to 40 years and coached a variety of different sports. We have 3 children, and we just 2 weeks ago had our first grandchild. So we are thrilled. He is 2 weeks and 1 day today. But sadly, my daughter and her husband are in California, so we have not yet seen him. We hope we'll see him in the next month or so. I also have 2 boys. My older boy is a math teacher coach, following in his father's footsteps. My younger boy is a wheeler dealer, hoping to be a wheeler dealer in commercial real estate. And he just got officially engaged.
Well, congratulations.
So, a lot going on at our house this past year.
Yes, it does. It sounds like you've got a lot of excitement, and congratulations about that grandchild. There's just nothing like welcoming that new life. And I know it'll be a thrill for you to go to California and greet that new member of your family. Now, what I wanted to ask you first is if you would tell us about where you got the idea for this story. And I understand you have a little slideshow for us and a guest speaker. So tell us about that.
Well, I do have a few slides I'd like to share with you all that tell a little bit about how I happened to write Crooked Truth, where the story came from. And I also have my most loyal fan and proofreader, Hewlin Webb. And he is going to read an excerpt from the 2nd chapter. So let me go ahead and share these slides with you. I grew up in a house full of books, and I've always been a reader-writer. I journaled and wrote in a little diary for years and years. I still journal. And as I got older, I became aware of how important story is in our lives. I think we're wired for story. It's part of our identity, part of our history, part of our culture. And every good teacher or preacher knows how powerful a good story can be. Well, every year we go to a Labor Day cookout down in South Georgia, in Stewart County, which borders Alabama. And one year after we'd eaten all of our barbecue, I heard a story from an elderly relative that really stuck with me. So much that I found myself actually making notes on lunch napkins. And when I was cleaning my office during the early days of the pandemic, I actually found those paper napkins. So I had to include them. The story this relative told was about a couple who lived in Lumpkin in the 20s and 30s, and they were farmers. They had both been widowed, and when she was in her late 40s, he was in his 50s. They married, and they had an unexpected son. But the son was born a mongoloid. This was before the term Downs ever came into use. And he was a sweet boy, but he was very, very limited. He never went to school. He couldn't read. He was hard to understand. And he spent most of the time on the farm. Well, he had an older half brother, and his half brother forced him to do most of the heavy work on the farm. And as their father got more feeble, the brother became more abusive and bullied him. He called him a moron, a dimwit, stupid, and there was very little the father could do to control him. When the father died, the situation got even worse. Things blew up, and I won't tell you what happened, but it was a disturbing ending that stuck with me, especially since at this time I was also working with a boy who had Down syndrome. And like Robert, the character from my book, he was a sweet boy, but he went to public school. He was in special ed classes. He was very limited. He couldn't tie his shoes. He could barely count to 8. He could write his name with some help, but he was well liked, and none of the kids made fun of him or bullied him. And he had the big advantage of coming from a very supportive family. But when I retired from the classroom, I decided I would take those 2 stories and put them together and write a novel. I already had a setting, a fictitious little community down in southwest Georgia called Crisscross, and a time period, 1948, and a farm located in the middle of cotton country. So I had the basic elements for my story. I also had main characters. I had Robert, the Mongoloid, Alvin Earl, his abusive half-brother, his parents, and a couple of longtime workers from the farm. But I needed somebody to narrate the story because I wanted to tell it in first person. So I came up with a 15-year-old boy named Lucas. And Lucas comes to the farm when he's 3. He's actually Robert's nephew, Granny's grandson. And when he first comes to the farm, he and Robert are great buddies. But as he gets older and starts going to school, he passes Robert and becomes Robert's reluctant caretaker, something he initially resents. Well, I worked on the story for several years. I joined a writer's group. I got a writing coach. I went to conferences. And finally, after many, many revisions and critiques, I had a manuscript. So I was ready to find an agent. And for those of you who've ever been interested in publishing, you probably know that an agent presents your work to a manuscript. He's representing you. But to get an agent, you have to sell your work, sell yourself, which means you send out query letters. Well, I sent out lots and lots of queries and got lots and lots of rejection. Nobody was very interested in my manuscript. And then I heard about Mercer Press's annual Farrell Sams Fiction Award. And it's an award, as Carolyn said, that's given to the work, the manuscript that best speaks to the condition, the human condition in a Southern context. And it's named for Farrell Sams, who's a Mercer graduate. He did his undergrad work there and then went on to become an MD and practiced for many, many years in Fayetteville with his wife, who was also an MD. And when he was in his mid-50s, he started writing autobiographical stories about growing up in Fayetteville. And some of you may have read one of his more famous, Run with the Horseman. This was about 2.5 days before the deadline for the contest. So I bundled up my manuscript in an old loose leaf notebook, rushed off to the FedEx, and sent it down to Macon. Then I started offering prayers, lighting candles. 5 or 6 months later, lo and behold, I get a telephone call from the editor at Mercer, and he tells me that Crooked Truth received the Farrell Sams Fiction Award. I won. I couldn't believe it. Talk about beginner's luck. And the best thing, I got a contract to publish with Mercer. Now, I had never had a contract before, so I assumed my book would be out within the next 7 or 8 months. I didn't realize what was involved in the publication process. Since I was not a well-known author, my manuscript went in the queue for more revisions, more edits, more layout discussion, and finally design. So after almost, it was actually more than 2 years, my book, which initially started out on a couple of paper napkins, was finally published. It was released last fall by Mercer. And here comes the plug. It's available at Mercer, Amazon, Foxtail, and a couple of other small bookstores. But I don't want you all to think that this was a smooth, easy process, because it wasn't. And I killed lots and lots of trees along the way. We do recycle. But it was a bumpy path filled with a lot of potholes and dead ends. But it was published, and I'm very thankful to Mercer for taking on my manuscript. And now my best critic is going to read a section from chapter 2. And this is a chapter where you'll see Robert, the Mongoloid uncle, Alvin Earl, his abusive older brother, their parents, and Lucas, our narrator. and they're all gathered together on a Saturday night in the small parlor while Granny Letty plays the piano and Robert sings.
It's an honor to be here tonight, and I need to tell you, it really was a lot of hard work for Kristine. I'm very proud of her, and she surely deserves the Farrell Sims Award. So let me read just a few lines from her book. As we sang, I heard Alvin Earl come in the back door and poke around the kitchen, searching for some leftover supper. When he couldn't find anything to eat, he came into the parlor and leaned against the wall. He wore a starched white shirt, and his shoes had more polish on them than Granny's piano. He'd slicked back his hair to hide his bald spot, and I could smell the Vitalis from across the room. A little dab of toilet paper clung to his chin, soaking up the blood from a shaving nick, and he had a cigarette stuck behind his ear. Granny droned on, and I heard a deep voice on the radio announcing tonight's episode. Fixing my eyes on the mantel clock, I slowly inched toward the kitchen, eager to make my escape. Robert, enjoying an audience, started another round of Clementine and swayed to the music. He had a high, sweet voice, but little bubbles of spit popped up on his lip when he sang, and he always got the words mixed up. After he finished the last line, Alvin Earl clapped and asked, "You can train a monkey or a dog to do tricks. Which one is he?" Granny jerked her pale fingers off the keys and froze. Alvin Earl's question hung in the air like a bad note, and silence filled the room. When no one answered, he asked again, "Is he a trained monkey or a circus dog doing tricks?" Glancing at Robert, I knew he didn't catch the sarcasm in Alvin Earl's voice or understand the question. He thought it was funny and laughed. "I'm not a monkey. I'm not a dog. I'm your brother." I don't get a word he's saying. He talks like he's got a mouthful of grits. Pulling out his lighter with a one-eyed Jack insignia, he flipped the top open. Then he spun the little rubber wheel around with his thumb. Robert stared at the silver lighter, and Granny frowned.
Thank you, Helen. I know, Kristine, that Helen used to teach at Westminster and coach there, and our daughter is there now. And
I know.
I think we have some people from Westminster watching tonight. So we appreciate Helen participating tonight. And it's wonderful characterization of these. I can just see Robert, I can see Alvin Earl and Lucas. You did such a good job of creating those characters. And the name Alvin Earl, was there somebody in your family named Alvin Earl?
No, but we had a neighbor who had a relative by that name.
I've never heard Alvin Earl, but I just thought that was a perfect name for him. It was wonderful. Well, and you have already answered some of the questions about going from being a nonfiction writer to being a fiction writer. And I think that is so much harder than we think. And I'm trying to do the same thing. So I'm very sympathetic to what you went through. What was the main thing that you learned, or two or three of the big differences between nonfiction and fiction?
I think the first thing was dropping some of the stiff, in the case of writing for graduate courses, dropping some of the stiff impersonal language and putting more life and energy into my writing.
Mhm.
Adding more detail about characters and their mannerisms, adding more dialogue, which I really enjoy writing, adding more descriptive detail about the setting, the locale, just making the writing more alive.
And you did a great job of it. And all of those things that you mentioned is a lot. I mean, describing the characters, writing dialogue, um, the detail, the emotion. I think it is much more difficult than we anticipate.
Yeah.
And that's what I wanted to point out. And you do have to rewrite and rewrite and revise and revise. And did you ever get really discouraged?
Oh, many times. And I think that was the value of having a writing group.
Mm-hmm.
People kind of buoyed one another up,
That's right.
gave
Yes,
them some encouragement.
exactly. Well, I want to talk about your overlapping themes in the book. Um, I think that it was so interesting the way you worked in um, the Black family and touched on race. And I don't think you can write a book about the South and not touch race. And you did a beautiful job of that. And then there's a secret there too. Now, what was your inspiration for that, or did you just come up with that family? Or I thought that was very well done. Little George, Cotton, and Corinthia.
Mm-hmm. The people, the relatives who lived in Lumpkin, well, they still are in Lumpkin, actually had a farmhand who was named George.
Mm-hmm.
So part of that came from the family situation. And Lucas needed a friend or a confidant, a buddy.
Mm-hmm.
So Cotton becomes his friend and confidant. And in some ways, I guess you could say he's almost a foil for Lucas because he's confident, he's outgoing, he's very comfortable with girls. And Lucas is shy and hesitant,
Mm-hmm.
doesn't like to speak out. But
Well, that was a
just-
beautiful relationship, and Lucas sneaks out and gets cigarettes from Cotton and all of that, and talks to him honestly, and that was really beautiful. And then you touch on class and a Jewish family
Right.
in South Georgia, which is rare, I'm sure.
Well, there actually was a Jewish family in Lumpkin.
Mm-hmm.
And they operated the one and only movie theater for many, many years. And that movie theater has long since closed. It became a public library, but there was a Jewish family.
Mm-hmm.
So part of that was based on the community history. And I also wanted to include a character who would be Lucas's first love interest.
Mm-hmm.
And he is very attracted to this girl whose father is Jewish and attended Emory.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons he's attracted to her is the fact that she's different from the other girls in Crisscross, and she's not afraid of being different.
Mm-hmm. Well, you did a beautiful job with her, and there were Jewish families sprinkled around. I know in Columbus and all over the South. They may not have been very many. There would be maybe one or two, but it was wonderful the way you worked them in. And of course, talking about the disability of Down syndrome, we call it now, and we have come a long way in our treatment of people with that disability. And you've pointed that out beautifully in that from your experience. And that was your main impetus for the book, wasn't it, in the beginning, was to talk about that Down syndrome child.
And how differently people with Downs were treated in the
Mhm.
20s and 30s, because many of them did end up at Milledgeville. People didn't know what else to do with them, where to put them. And
Exactly.
if the families couldn't afford to provide some care,
Mhm.
many were sent to Milledgeville.
And it was great the way Granny was determined to keep him there. And Lucas loved him and was protective of him, even though as he grew older, he didn't want to have to take care of him all the time. But it was wonderful, their relationship and being in the room together. And when the fire, when the fire breaks out and how Lucas has to go in and rescue Robert, that was well done. And of course, you talk about addiction, more than one addiction in the book. We
Right.
touch on the background. Was there any background in the family of addiction?
In my family. But I would guess that most people, most families do have some issues with addiction.
Mhm. Well, I was thinking also about gambling, uh, because gambling is an addiction, just like
Right,
alcohol is an addiction. And Alvin Earle had the combination
right.
of those addictions. Um, do you identify with any of the characters?
I think I identify mostly with Lucas, the idea of him seeing what needs to be done and realizing that there's no one on the farm who can really protect Robert but himself. He can't look to any of the help because of their situation.
Mhm.
A black man can't go up a white man against a white man.
Mhm. And there was always that uh, question of what's going to happen to Robert when uh, Granny and Pa died. Papa.
Right,
And
right,
we see both of those people passing away. And that is a very real problem in a family where you have, at that time, particularly when you had somebody with disabilities, because there were not any classes you could send them to. Like now, there are certain places that you can get community activity for Down syndrome people and all of that. So um, that was well done. Um, did you have any experience of having your story you thought it was going to go one way and then it switched and went another way?
no, yes. And I meant to mention that, but initially I had a different title and the story was going to be more of a mystery. But then as my characters became more real to me, I changed the title. I changed Lucas's name because Lucas is related to the word light, luminate. And I had written two endings before I finally landed on the ending that seemed right.
Mhm. Well, I've heard writers say that sometimes their characters just take over and speak to them, and I think that is an interesting thing to talk about. And you talked about the title. I wanted to get into this. I know you don't want to talk about the ending because everybody hasn't read the book, but I imagine a lot of our women have read the book, but we can talk about it indirectly. The theme, crooked truth, and writing about something that is right. Is it legal or is it right? Or vice versa. You know what I'm talking about. And I think that is a very complex issue that you've woven into your book. What do you feel like you can tell us about that?
I think there are different types of truth. There's a spiritual truth, there's scientific truth, there's historical truth, there's a moral truth. And Lucas is forced to deal with a moral truth. And he ends up making a decision that he feels is appropriate, necessary for the circumstances and the family.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a good way to describe it. And that just makes everybody that hasn't read the book very anxious to read it and figure out exactly what you're talking about. Now, let's just ask some little practical questions. And I want to remind everyone, if they want to put a question in chat, they're welcome to, and I will come to it later. And now the pandemic, how did that affect you? Was that a blessing or a curse? And how did it affect your writing?
It was a big plus because it eliminated a lot of distractions. And I had been rolling around ideas for a follow-up novel, and it gave me the time to do some research and make a lot of progress on my follow-up novel, which will involve Lucas and Cotton.
Well, that was one thing I was going to ask you about. You beat me to the punch. But I do think back to the question I asked you about the pandemic. I have found, and I've told some people this, but I had a manuscript sitting on a shelf that I had started 20 years ago. And I wasn't planning to do this at all. And I pulled it off the shelf and I started putting it on a Word document. And then when I started typing, I just kept typing like for 6 months every day. And I've said to myself, it was a godsend during the pandemic. And I imagine your work was a godsend to you because you had a lot of time on your hands, but yet you had a task that was meaningful and something that took up a lot of your time. And I ended up feeling like, oh, it was just wonderful. I don't even know if I ever would have picked this manuscript up and done anything with it had it not been for the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
And
I think the time was a real gift. And opening my schedule, I didn't have as many things I needed or felt I needed to do each day, so I could write in longer stretches.
Well, I think we've learned how much of our time is taken up by maybe things that we don't always have to do. You know, we go and go and go, and maybe we don't have to go as much. And I think that we can make choices that will help us to have this quiet time. I know I've read so much more than I normally do. And just thank goodness, I love to read. And I don't know what I would have done without reading during the pandemic. We all in this group, we all love to read, but that has been a real gift. Now, I've heard that writers do not finish your book, they abandon it. And your characters stayed with you. You've touched a little bit about your next plan, but did that happen with Cotton and Lucas? They just stayed in your mind?
Yes. They are very real to me. And the families are very real to me.
So you're taking them ahead your book was set in 1948 and a little bit after that. So are you taking them much later in their life?
My next book is set in 1962, and Cotton has actually gone north to play professional baseball. He's a pitcher and he's a lefty.
Oh, southpaw.
Right.
That's
so
great.
He's one of the first colored players on a professional team in Cleveland. And Lucas has stayed in the South, but he's become a writer.
Is he a sports writer?
He does some sports writing. And he gets an assignment up in Cleveland.
Oh,
So
that's
he
great.
and Cotton reunite.
Uh-huh.
And then there's a new character who's also a baseball player. He's much younger. He gets injured by a fly ball. He gets hit in the face and
Mhm.
he loses his eye.
Which can happen, yes. Mhm.
So his baseball career is abruptly ended. And he never makes it to the majors.
Oh, the other guy, but Cotton does, but this other player
Cotton does, but this new character, William,
Mm-hmm.
his career is abruptly ended, and he goes to seminary
Oh, okay.
and gets involved with the civil rights movement.
Oh, that sounds very interesting. Very interesting. Now, did you research the Cleveland baseball team to know what year they had the first had black players?
Yes, and they actually signed a player a few months after Jackie Robinson, who is from Georgia,
Mm-hmm.
was signed. Larry Doby was signed by the Cleveland Indians, but he never got the coverage or hype Jackie Robinson got.
Okay. Well, that's and that shows you how, when you're writing a historical novel, the research that you have to do. And I noticed Margaret Atwood's master class. I don't know if you watched that.
Mm-hmm.
She says, you've got to be very careful about your research because somebody will catch you. If you didn't, like if you had black players going to Cleveland too early or something like that, of course, you're making a fictional character, but the years that things actually happened and all of that, you have to do research.
Yes.
And,
yes. And I will say, I think that was one of the pluses of having a more academic background and some journalism, because you're trained to be careful with dates and facts.
That's right. That's right. And so that was helpful. And even knowing how to do research. I mean, there's certain techniques. Of course, research is easier now than it was in the old days.
Right.
The internet, we can find out so much information, but still, just to know how to pursue that and to enjoy research. I always enjoyed research, and they said historians, they usually like research, and they can do research and do research and research, and finally you have to stop and write.
Exactly.
That's the challenge, because you have all this material and you have to bring it together to weave it into your book. Well, tell us, who are some of your favorite authors?
Oh, I have so many, Carolyn. And I'm reading differently now than I used to read. I used to read fairly quickly, but I'm reading more slowly because I'm looking at things like how authors use their setting, how they introduce their characters and develop them, how they use dialogue, how they develop their themes. But Steinbeck is one of my favorites. O'Connor. I like John Grisham, and I think he can be a great storyteller. I like Farrell Sams, and I think Stephen King is very talented. And of course, Hemingway. So there's a lot of different people.
Well, and you've mentioned different writers that from different, some are more academic than others. I mean, if you say John Grisham, some people say, well, he's not really a serious writer, but he has that ability to get your attention and keep your interest. And anybody that can do that, you can learn from that.
Right.
Okay.
And I think people write differently today. I think authors get into their inciting incident, that problem or situation, in the first chapter, maybe even within the first couple of pages, because they know they have to hook a reader. People's attention spans are shorter. They don't want the detail and the description.
That is certainly true. I have go ahead. Did you want to finish something? I just was going to read a comment.
No, go ahead.
We have a comment from a reader who grew up in the South. You mastered the Black dialect of that era. I could really visualize Corinthia and the others who reminded me of beloved people I knew growing up. And that's a good comment. There's a certain dialect you have to have.
I taught in a Title I school for many, many years, and we had a lot of minorities.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when you become a writer, in some ways, you become almost a voyeur, because you're always looking, you're always watching, you're always listening.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd love to go to the mall or someplace where there's a lot of people coming in and out, and just sit down at a table with a cup of coffee and kind of watch people coming in and out.
That's right. Well, and some people in families where they have a writer, they think they see themselves in a novel. It may not even be them, but they think it's them. So you have to be careful with family members.
Right.
But that's fun. Another question is, did the author have to do much research about the South during the 20s and the 30s? Or did you know very much about farming before setting your novel on a farm?
I did a lot of formal and informal interviewing. And I think that was another area where my journalism experience was helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Because I had learned how to interview people. And I just asked lots and lots of questions. We have a plumber who's from a little town in Georgia, and he probably did more work at my house while I was writing Crooked Truth than any other period, because he was somebody who would respond, and he loved to talk.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I can remember growing up, I'm probably older than you are, but I can remember living with my grandparents when my parents were working in town. And I remember going to the field and seeing my grandfather plowing. And I remember them slaughtering the hog. And there's certain memories that I have from my childhood that I didn't live on a farm all the time, but I visited their farm. And I could just see that farm, and I could see the cotton fields, and I could see the old fence and the dirt roads and all of that because of my childhood experience. And so you pick up things from your own childhood, and then you, like I say, do research and all that. Okay, if anybody else wants to send a comment, I'm looking to see if there's a comment while we're talking. Would you just tell us, some of the women may be out there thinking, well, I'd like to write a novel, and I know I'm trying to write a novel right now. What would your advice be to somebody that feels like, well, they want to write a novel, but they don't know if they can or not?
I would say, if you want to write a novel, I think you have to read some novels, because in reading, you just absorb what I was talking about earlier. How do writers introduce their characters? How do they use dialogue? How do they develop their plot and the pacing?
Well, every writer that I've ever heard talking about writing, they say, read, read, read.
Right.
We must keep reading all the time. And I think sometimes you just absorb things by osmosis. You don't really realize that you're learning, but you get a sense of, and I think particularly dialogue. You want to, as a writer friend of ours said one time, talk to the page.
Right.
And you're just talking. and you want it to be relaxed, and you don't want it to be stiff and all of that. And so it's and you can tell sometimes when you're trying to write dialogue when it is stiff, and you just have to throw that out and start over and be more relaxed about it.
And it's sometimes I think it's hard for writers to step out of their own voice into the voice of the characters.
And it was interesting, you were writing as a woman, you were writing as a young male. You had to speak in his voice. Was that difficult at all?
Well, because I had two boys,
That's right.
but I was involved, I'm still involved in a critique group. And people would call me, and they would call me on my dialogue, and they'd say, this doesn't sound natural, or I don't think a 15-year-old kid would really say something like this.
Mm-hmm.
And that's another if you're really thinking about writing a novel, I would find a good critique group.
Mm-hmm. Like you mean like a writing workshop, or a group of
a group that meets on a regular basis, and you share your writing and give one another feedback. And Atlanta has so many writers and so many writing groups.
Well, I have to give a plug to Ann Height, the writer that many of you know, who's written so many wonderful novels. She has been editing my novel and has a writing group that I have attended. So I've laughingly said I wrote my novel and then I went to a creative writing class. I did things sort of in reverse, but then you keep rewriting and working on it. And I keep saying all the time, it's great fun. I mean, I'm really enjoying it. And I think as long as you can enjoy it and stay with the task and realize that it's not going to be easy, and that it gets better with each rewrite. Like I think I've laughingly said I'm on the 5th, but it's probably really the 6th or the 7th. I don't know. You just keep rewriting.
And James Michener says the real writing comes with the rewriting.
Yes, yes. And I heard you say on one of your interviews, and it's so cute. What did Anne Lamott say about the first draft of her book?
She said the first drafts are always shitty. And that was the word she used.
I can hear Anne Lamott saying something like that.
Right.
Yeah, you just, they're horrible. And yet, but I did have the story. You have the grain, the basic outline of your story. And you know the story you want to tell, but then you have to begin to polish it, and you have to begin to rewrite and all of that. And that's something I did not really expect, that it would be this much rewriting. But then I can read my first draft and now the 5th or 6th, and I can see such a huge difference. And I just sent mine in, by the way. You've been asking me.
Oh, good. Good for you,
yesterday for to get a, and then they'll tell me to rewrite and rewrite some more. But that was a milestone, getting that in. Now I was going to say, let's see. Is there anything else that you would, any other advice? Let me check and see. Any thoughts on a prequel, perhaps looking at Lucas's parents before Lucas is born? Have you thought about that?
No, I haven't, but I did go to a book talk last night that I think it's Mary Hall Kelly did for Lilac Girls.
Martha Hall Kelly.
Martha Hall Kelly, right. And she has done 2 prequels for Lilac Girls.
And, you know, we had Martha Hall Kelly. She came to Women Alone Together book group when Lilac Girls first came out, and she was living here in Atlanta. And I contacted her and asked her to come and talk. Our women will remember Martha Hall Kelly talking about Lilac Girls. And she was so generous and so sweet. And she was getting ready to move back to Connecticut, I believe it was. And when she came into our group, we were meeting at the Colonnade restaurant where we've met for years in a
Mhm.
big banquet room. And we had like 35 or 40 women sitting at the table. And Martha Hall sat there and she said, I thought we'd have 5 or 6 women sitting around a table. And she was very impressed that we had so many people that wanted to read her book and that we had so many women in attendance. And so then some of us went to the History Center and saw her when she spoke about her next book. It was the one with the Russian. I don't know if you've read that. It's some of our women.
Something roses, I
Yes,
think.
yes. And but anyway, I remember her characters very well, and she did a great job on that. And we've been so fortunate in Women Alone together to have so many authors in the last few years to come. And very often we have caught them before their book gets really big and before it would really get hard to get them. The best story of, I missed her by maybe a month, but when The Help came out, uh, tell me her name that wrote The Help. Oh, I know her. And so all our women are saying I can't hear them now. But
Is it socket?
yeah,
Something
Catherine
socket?
Stockett. She
Yeah.
lived here in Garden Hills, right nearby. And she was at the Mercer luncheon as one of the guest speakers. And so I went up to her table. I had brought her book, and I asked her if she would be able to come and speak to Women Alone Together. And she said, "Well, I would love to, but I'm going to Amsterdam." and I'm talking to Steven Spielberg. In other words, she had hit the big time. And so we missed her, but we took about a dozen of our women to Peachtree Road Methodist Church when she spoke to 1,200 women from this area.
Wow.
A huge
Wow.
turnout, standing room, people standing in the back. And it was very successful. They were going to have a banquet kind of setting, but there were so many women and men who wanted to hear her that they moved it to the sanctuary, and it was standing room only. So we did her book, and that's one of the biggest crowds we've ever had, but we didn't have her there in person.
Mhm.
But now we've got you in person. So when you hit the big time and when your book's made into a movie, you'll remember that you were with us. And so let me see if we have any other questions. Where are you originally from?
I was born in Baltimore, but I spent most of my growing up years in Ohio, and then came to Atlanta after I graduated from college.
So you've been here a long time, but I
Yes.
can sort of hear that you've got another. You're not as Southern sounding as
As human.
maybe I am. I don't know. When I lived in Wisconsin and California, and we've lived in a lot of different places, everybody was always talking about my Southern accent. And I was always saying, I don't think I have a Southern accent, but at any rate, well, let me, if there is any other question, I don't see it in chat. Well, this has been a wonderful, wonderful discussion, and we congratulate you on your book. And we do hope you'll come back when you do your next book. And also continue to come and visit with us when we do our book programs. And I want to tell our women quickly that we have an all-star cast lineup for the fall. In September, Elizabeth Cobb, who is a professor at Texas A&M, is going to come and talk about her book, Tubman's Command, about Harriet Tubman and when she led the Union Army in a particular situation, and she had to do some spying and all of that. I really look forward to that. And she will be with us in September, not in person, but in our hybrid programs. So many of you that are living in other parts of the country or in Macon or North Carolina, or even we've had Laura Voisinay in Oregon, have asked us to keep doing Zoom programs. So what we're going to do in the fall is what we call a hybrid, where if you're not here, you will be able to attend. We'll do some kind of Zoom, and then we're going to have in person. But we're working on the exact logistics of that. We don't know exactly where it will be or how we'll do it, but we're working on, because some of you have commented that I really miss the camaraderie. I miss seeing each other. And that's a big part of what we do. So in September, Elizabeth Cobb will be here from Texas. And then in October, since it's Halloween, we're going to have Ann Height, that we just mentioned earlier, who writes about ghosts and Black Mountain. And she's going to be talking about her book, Where the Souls Go. And I imagine Ann will be in person, but we will put that also on Zoom. And then in November, we're going to have Lisa Wingate to talk about Before We Were Yours. It came out several years ago, but it was such a hit. And we tried to get her earlier, but I've been emailing with her and she's excited about being with us, and we'll work out the exact logistics of that. And then Lisa Schulman, who is a professor at the University of Maryland, is going to be doing a program for us about loss, one of our seminars, probably in November. And we'll have more details about that later. But we've got a wonderful lineup for the fall, and we've got Bells for Eli next month with Susan Sorenda. So be sure to be with us then. And we will finish off this year with a very successful program. And I'm really proud of what we've done, having to go with Zoom, but we've had wonderful programs, wonderful authors, and great attendance. And thank you very much. And everybody, come register for next month and we'll see you then. And thank you again, Kristine. We really enjoyed your discussion.
Thank you, Carolyn. And thanks to all the folks who Zoomed in with us.
Okay. You all have a wonderful evening. Thank you.